In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Primos Dame, an affordable steel gravel bike. The price is right, but is it any good? Let's find out. Okay, so there are a bunch of reviews of the Primos Dame out on YouTube, and to be honest, I have not watched any of them because I didn't want them to influence my review, but definitely watch those, get their opinions as well. I know Nolan from the Bike Sauce did one, which I'm sure is good. He does quality work, so go check that out. Also, I'm reviewing the Primos in a slightly modified form, so this isn't exactly a stock build, but I'll get into that later in the video. So Primos is a newish brand based in Portland, Oregon, but the founders have been big in the South American fixed gear scene for a while. So they're taking all their bike industry knowledge and are applying it to this new brand, Primos. So the frame and fork are 4130 chromoly. The build comes with 650B by 50mm Continental tires, but it has a stated clearance of 55 in 650B, or you could do 700 by 50, or even 26-inch by 3 if you want to put some really big meats in there. The frame is nicely outfitted with a whole assortment of adventure nipples on the top tube, 3 packs on the fork, a pair of water bottle cages. There's double eyelets at the fork so you can run both a rack and a fender, which is super important if you're living in the Pacific Northwest. Ditto in the rear, it's got eyelets for both a rear rack and fender. In terms of utility, the bike has it in spades. Other nice touches for the price point is that you get a flat mount standard as well as through axle wheels. Usually with other bikes in this price range, it's quick release. I think the main benefit of that is that it's easier to realign the wheel, and also it's going to be a little bit easier to find an upgrade wheel set further down the line. The rims are also supposed to be tubeless compatible, but in my time with the bike, I've just run it with stock tires and with tubes. The brakes are by Tektro, and the bike comes with compressionless housing from Jaguar right out of the box to squeeze the most out of the Tektro mechanical disc. The drivetrain uses the very excellent for the money Microshift Sword, which I've talked a lot about on this channel, so I'm not going to go into like an in-depth review with it. The TLDR is that it's a great, relatively affordable all-mechanical drivetrain. Ergonomics and finish are very similar to GRX. The stock build of the bike is 1x. It has an 11-46 rear cassette and a 44-tooth 1x Pro wheel crankset. Personally, I thought the stock gearing was too high. For me, barely 1-to-1, which I think is okay for like a lightweight road bike, but for a heavier, more adventure-oriented gravel bike, geared a little too high. So I modded it to a quick and dirty DIY 2x setup. I swapped out the Microshift Sword 1x rear derailleur for a 2x1. The front derailleur is a Q's front-loading top swing front derailleur, and that's actuated in the most lazy way possible by running it straight to a bar end shifter. I put in our prototype cranks, which are a 38-26, and the cassette is 11-38, and all of this is shifting perfectly together. Complete bike with pedals, I think in the stock form, weighed in at about 28 pounds on the hour scale. So how does the bike ride? The bike has a chainstay length of 425 and a trail figure of 65. So for all practical purposes, it felt a lot like a fat-tired endurance road bike. The shortish rear made it feel fun and responsive. It has a relatively steep seat tube angle at 74, which I personally like, having shorter legs. I felt like I could really get on top of the cranks. Climbing, it's nice and responsive, and the front end handling it's fairly neutral. On level terrain, no surprises, responsive enough. Descending, it was nice and predictable. In other words, the geometry isn't anything out there. It's not anything weird. If anything, it just feels relatively familiar, similar to endurance road bikes or your typical gravel bike geometry. So this makes for an all-good, all-rounder riding experience on paved roads and dirt roads. You could take it on some occasional trail, but if that's what you're planning to do for extended periods, there are better bike geometries for that. But think of this as basically a nice steel all-road bike. Okay, so let's talk about the gearing. Like I said, for me, the stock gearing was just too high, especially if you live anywhere hilly or plan to carry things on the bike. And I go a step further and say for any like true newbie to cycling, which this bike is directly aiming at. I just think it's too high. I personally would have preferred, at least a 40 tooth, if not a 38 tooth. In terms of the brakes, the Tektros took a few rides to really bed in and become effective. Still not as powerful as high-end mechanical discs like the clampers or, equal brakes. But for the price and the intended user, I think it's perfectly serviceable and totally fine. I would throw in with the caveat that I would give it a few rides to really get them to settle in to hit their peak braking performance. If there's anything that's really holding the bike back, in my opinion, is probably the wheels, but that's sort of to be expected at this price point. While the geometry is quick and responsive and familiar, the heavier wheels made it all feel a bit subdued, muted. It just all felt like a little dulled down, if that makes any sense. And really, this became, more obvious when you tried to accelerate very quickly, or if you were standing and climbing and giving it the stick. That said, would the kind of target segment buying this bike notice? Most likely not. But having tried bikes with nicer wheels, it is something that I noticed. The tires are nice and supple. I did find that they had more of a squarish profile on the relatively wide internal rim width of 27 millimeter, which is surprisingly wide. It took me a while to get used to how they corner, especially in that kind of transition phase of the tire. There's lots to love. I love all the mounting options. It really calls out to be a platform for commuting and adventure. So overall, pretty good. But at $7.99, what are the downsides? Look, you're not going to get 12-year, Isla Scotch whiskey on a Budweiser budget. Some decisions and concessions have to be made to get to this price point. The question really becomes, did they economize and prioritize the right things? First off, I think microshift at this price point is a great choice. You get a good shifting experience, good ergonomics. The brakes, this is kind of debatable and tough. Out of the box, they don't stop that well, and they do really need some time to bed in. But once they did, they worked fine. It's not going to feel as good as a hydraulic disc brake or a higher end mechanical. But then, for the price, we have to keep in mind the expectations for the budget. The crankset, although overgeared, was surprisingly using a 24 millimeter spindle, external bottom bracket, and the chainring could be swapped with any other SRAM 3-bolt chainring. So that was kind of a pleasant surprise. Usually at this price point, it's going to be like a fixed chainring to the crank and a square taper. But here, even though the chainring size is not my favorite, it can be upgraded. If I were to get really nitpicky, the welds could be a little bit nicer, especially, a challenge with light colored paint since it highlights imperfections so much. But there are areas where the welds are a little bit blobby. The rear dropout looks a little too industrial and kind of out of a Lego set for my taste. But again, keeping in mind who is buying this bike, it's things that aren't going to affect the riding experience and more about aesthetics and just being super anal. Like I said, you do get through axles for this price, which is a bit of a rarity and does make a potential wheel upgrade down the line a little bit easier. So for $7.99 for a new bike in $20-25, what you get is pretty good. You get a frame with playful geometry, great control, supple tires, meh wheel set. Some things gotta give, and the wheels are generally where it happens, even up until like the $3,000, $4,000 price point. How does it compare to other new bikes in the class? Compared to the 4130 State All-Road, that's probably going to be the first question. The All-Road is UDH compatible if that's what you want. The All-Road has 1x12, which 10 is fine as long as the gearing is right. The All-Road does have a little bit more reasonable gearing with a 40 tooth chainring in the front. That said, the State is also $300 more, and the geometry is completely different. Like the geometry on the State is much longer in the rear. It's got a little bit more of a relaxed and stable riding experience, so not as quick handling as the Dame. Probably a more compelling comparison, something a little bit closer to it, would be the Poseidon Ambition, which is actually $50 less. It has similar-ish geometries, so again, the shorter rear end, the more kind of endurance road geometry, if you will. It also has a lot more reasonable gearing with 11-48 in the rear and a 38 tooth chainring in the front. So from the gearing perspective, the Poseidon's a better choice. It also has a carbon fork, The frame is aluminum, but the wheels are quick release and it comes with square taper cranks. So as you can see, there are nuanced pros and cons between those three choices. I don't think any of them really hits it out of the park. I think if the Dame came with a 38 tooth chainring, it'd be a little bit easier differentiation. Again, the sub $1,000 price point is a tough range because you're not just competing with new bikes, but you're competing with the used market as well. You could arguably get more bike for the same money if you go used, but it's highly dependent on stock in your local market. There's no guarantee you're going to find a bike that fits you in the color you want at the time that you want. So something like the Dame is a good option to get a reasonably well-spec'd and thought-out bike for the money without playing the used bike waiting game. So overall, for $799, I think it's a pretty good option. You know, it's not going to be the same as like a bike in the $1,500 or $2,000 price point. That's just an unrealistic expectation. But within this sub $1,000 range, it offers a fair amount. For me, the gearing thing is like the biggest thing I'm hung up on. And like some finer points like the welds and the dropouts and all that kind of bike nerdy stuff. But I think as a freshman effort from a newish bike brand that's trying to hit this affordable bike segment, which I think is definitely needed, I think they did a great job. You know, I'd probably lean towards this than any kind of Walmart bike, to be perfectly honest. If you're considering a bike from Walmart or this, I'd go this direction. But that's what I think. Let me know what you guys think. And if you guys dug this review and like our focus on utilitarian, interesting bikes that aren't just, you know, plastic, hit the like button, consider supporting us on Patreon. But that's how we're able to keep the lights on, through the great support of our Patreon supporters and our sticker and merch sale. So check out those links below. And as always, keep the supple side down.